Hello everyone and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. For those of you who are new here, my name is Megan Lewis and I'm your host along with my husband, Dr. Joshua Bowen. Today I am delighted to be joined by Tristan Samuels, who's a PhD candidate in Africology at Temple University. Tristan, welcome. Thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you, Megan. Thank you for inviting me to share your platform and engage in a fruitful dialogue. Looking forward to it. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. I suspect I'm going to be learning an awful lot today, which is honestly my favorite way to run interviews. So to just kind of get started, would you mind just introducing yourself and explaining how you got into this field?
Okay, so I am Tristan Samuels. Got to start. It just flows when I start with the name. I'm a doctoral candidate in Africology at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Just to clarify for what Africology is, for those who might not be familiar, in the United States, you have what's called Black Studies, has various nomenclature such as Afro-American Studies, African-American Studies, Africana Studies, not Afrikaner. That has happened before, believe me. Africana Studies, and then Africology is one of the nomenclature. And what it is about Africology that is distinct, to put it in a concise way, is that it's an Afrocentric approach to Black studies, essentially. In the most reductionist, concise way, and probably throughout the interview, we can get into more of the implications of that. So I'm a doctoral student. My research is focusing on centers on African languages, the epistemological significance. My dissertation research, more specifically, is looking at Medu-Neter, or what we may know as the ancient Egyptian language in more Eurocentric terms, from an Afro-Caribbean perspective, in terms of grammar and syntax. Mm-hmm. That's my primary focus at the moment. How I got into this field, or just in the study of Kemet, what some may know as ancient Egypt. That's it's such a simple question. I think just my passion for African civilizations started very young. I'd say at least maybe 10, 12 years old, somewhere in that preteen arena. And I think that's very significant for why I talk the way I talk about certain things. I would say that as it grew and grew and grew, but what made Kemet stand out in particular is that it's very foundational for a lot of things that we see in contemporary, because I'm interested in ancient Nubia as well. I also engage in that for contemporary civilizations, but also later African civilizations and cultures that we see today in the contemporary context. So it's where do you begin? And that's kind of where Kemet gets priority for me, because it was very interesting. Civilizations I was really interested in studying and learning more about were really West African civilizations. But then as I started to grow further, because I was always into all, but at first West Africa was kind of in the lead. Then Kemet sort of catches up. Part of it is academic resources as well too, and institutionalization and stuff, and just the nature of information. But I would say, to really understand, African history or African culture, you have to start at the earliest point. So, that's where it starts and ends with me. If I had to be fantastic.
It's nice. I ask this question to pretty much everyone who comes on the show, and the vast majority of people have not the same answer, but it often goes back to like very early childhood and saying, well, I was 11 and I read this and it seemed really cool, or I was 11 or 12 and I found out about this particular aspect of history and it just really engaged me and grabbed my attention. History is wonderful. So you mentioned Afrocentricity. Would you be able to give kind of a bit more of a fuller explanation of exactly what Afrocentricity is? And you and I have talked about this a little bit in our emails. So you distinguish between Afrocentricity as an intellectual paradigm and Afrocentrism as a pop culture phenomenon. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I do. Actually, did I give you a reading for that?
I feel you did, yes.
Okay, good. Man, the name of the article, Yehudah, the Yehudah reading is really good. He does this really beautifully, how he articulates. But to make a long story short, Afrocentricity, like as you were saying, thank you for that intro, it's an intellectual perspective that's grounded in African history and culture. And that grounding is what informs the way that we look at African phenomena. So, for example, in my research, this for my research, for example, I'm looking at the ancient Egyptian language, or what I would call Medu Neter. Again, I stick with the indigenous African terms.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you're centering, African culture, history, and knowledge. That's why, we speak about Kemet as opposed to ancient Egypt. We usually do that because most audiences are familiar with that. But I'm looking at it from the perspective of Afro-Caribbean languages to really change the way that we study African languages and some of the
Mm-hmm.
cultural implications. That's not necessarily something somebody who might be studying Egypt in its African context might think about.
Mm-hmm.
Do you get what I mean? Like, you might say, okay, okay, we agree that, ancient Egypt, I'm just being, because I say Kemet, but, I'm very dramatic, by the way. I like to act out things. So, ancient Egypt, yeah, I agree it's African. We're going to look at it in context of Nubia, maybe in context of some other cultures in Northeast Africa, the Shilluk people, the Beja people. But that's a content thing, right? That's a content-oriented approach. Afrocentricity, it's how you look at the conversation. So, for example, an Afrocentrist isn't going to ask a question like, what is Kemet's relationship to Africa? It's already assumed, right,
Mm-hmm.
that there's a cultural underpinning. What we're looking at is how that underpinning unfolds, right? And we wouldn't exclude the diaspora out of that conversation. So it's not just about the continent, but it's African people, and Africa follows us wherever we go, whether we want to hear it or not, because not all African people in the diaspora or even the continent like that idea, but it's a factor, right? I always go to hair. Where's the first image that you see? Locks in Kemet. Then you see it in West Africa. Then you see it in Jamaica. Then you see it in the United States. Many African-American male athletes, also female actors and actresses, but you get the point of what I'm getting at. If you just see locks, let's go with hairstyles, locks as a African-American hairstyle, that's ahistorical when you look at it in a larger from an Afrocentric perspective. But Afrocentricity, to be more specific to the intellectual context, the academic context, was coined by the chair of the Africology department, Molefe Kete Asante, in 1980, around 1978, 1980. That's when it really started as an intellectual theory and perspective. And then it was later formulated into a paradigm by Dr. Amel Mazama, who's also based at Temple University. So Temple University is really the hub for Afrocentricity and the discipline of Africology.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Is that clear?
It does. It does. Thank you very much. And it's interesting for me as someone coming from completely the other side of like an educational background, to try and understand how you can use like an Afrocentric lens to investigate cultures that are African and should be understood as African, and so often have their blackness, their Africanness completely erased by the people who are studying it and by the academic institution. So what does this look like when we're looking at history? So how drastically does an Afrocentric approach kind of alter our understanding of the past, and then how does that play into looking at Egypt specifically?
Okay, so two things. There was one
Sorry,
thing
that's
I
like
forgot
8 million questions.
One thing, no, there was one thing I forgot to mention in a previous question. So knowing that Afrocentricity is an intellectual paradigm with its own tenets and such, Afrocentrism is usually used in academia, really, especially during the 90s, where a very tense academic racial climate in the United States. It's usually used to describe any person talking about, really usually a Black intellectual, almost 99.9% of the time, right? Anyone, with the exception of maybe Martin Bernal, right? But who's ever talking about Africa in a quote unquote positive light or connecting African Americans to Africa. It's just called Afrocentrism, and it's just lumped into a bunch of things.
Mm-hmm.
So I did want to emphasize that part. So that distinction is important because that's not necessarily the intellectual discourse that I'm engaged in.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that distinction is important. Now, more to your other question. Actually, could you repeat it?
Yeah,
I
sure.
think
So when we're using Afrocentricity, how does that impact our understanding of the past, and how does maybe your view of Egypt as a culture and society change?
well, you start to, for me, there's a few. What's a good one? I'll give an example. How I look at there's a lot. I just want to think of what can I do in a really good. Okay, I'll give an example for your audience. The pharaoh, the female pharaoh Hatshepsut of Kemet. She's a New Kingdom pharaoh, or Nesubiti rather. They have different names for the national leadership. Um, One of the issues that I observe in Egyptology is the idea that there was some sort of gender type of conflict with Hatshepsut.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at Hatshepsut in an African cultural context, within African leadership systems, indigenous African leadership systems, not African people in parliaments and those are European political systems. Whether it's not whether they're good or bad or not, I'm just saying the cultural context.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at her in an African context of leadership, she's not that remarkable. So, for example, you have in West Africa the Asante kingship system. In some of the ethnic groups there, they have women who take up the masculine stool of rulership. There's instances like that, but it wasn't anything that was negative or pathological. It was just a situational occurrence, right? But there's also at the same time the feminine leadership position is also extremely valued. It works in a complementary fashion. And I haven't really seen that type of analysis applied to Kemet. Usually I can only think of maybe two exceptions, one article and one book and article. Lena Troy, I think she had a dissertation about the meaning of queenship in ancient Egypt. I think she was the closest to coming. She was one of the closest that I've read. And this could just be, my ignorance of the literature, but she's the closest I've seen. And there's another article, an Egyptologist writing on Nefertiti. It's just the name of the article escapes me.
Mm-hmm.
But those were the two. I'll probably look it up maybe during if we have a break or something. I'll look it up and come back to that. But those were the two pieces that I felt, two authors that I felt have touched on it. But in the larger African-based tradition. So when I say African-based tradition, I mean scholars that talk about Kemet in its African context, not necessarily from an Afrocentric perspective, but recognizing that it is African.
Mm-hmm.
Usually we talk about, or always we talk about, complementarity in African societies. So when you look at Hatshepsut in that context, even how gender and rulership work, she's not really that remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at it from an Egyptological perspective, which is inherently Eurocentric, it comes off as she's like a Joan of Arc. Like I feel like sometimes we're reading a story about Joan of Arc and not really an African woman in an African society.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
In my view, that's my argument. That would be an example.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So what for you are some of the challenges that you face with using an Afrocentric approach in academia?
Okay, there's two types. I would say because it's switched for me because of my discipline. Sorry, oh, I think I rocked the table. Because of my disciplinary change. So, I did my MA in history, and it's not called that, but I refer to it as that, history and Greco-Roman studies. I really
Mm-hmm.
think there needs to be a change away from classics to Greco-Roman studies,
Mm-hmm.
or in the least bit, say European classics. I don't mind if you're saying your focus is the Greco-Roman view, an orientation of how you're looking at the history, that's fine, but don't call it the classics, because
Mm-hmm.
you know, as one of my great influences, Shelley Haley, great African American female classicist, one of my major influences, she would say, well, what about classical Nigeria? What about classical so and so and
Mm-hmm.
X? This very, you know, the white supremacy in that is very evident. But so I had a BA in history, and Greco-Roman studies was a minor. So I had a lot of history courses, because what it was, the Greco-Roman studies, or what would be called at York University, the classical studies, major, minor, the classes were interdisciplinary. So I already had history credits in the field, and then I added the language and some humanities courses in there. So it overlaps. So, and my BA thesis was on deconstructing Blackness in a Greco-Roman perspective. Then my MA was in Egyptology. I didn't really feel, see, when I was doing my BA, I didn't really feel any type of real challenge from faculty really significant.
Mm-hmm.
It's more so when I see sort of, I guess, the Eurocentrism, racism, it'd be more in literature I was reading
Mm-hmm.
more so. Then now, okay, so I get out of that. I get into University of Toronto. I'm doing, oh, York University is also in Toronto. I was born in Toronto,
Mm-hmm.
born and I'm schooled in Toronto. Now my MA, I get into Egyptology now. Um, that's where I start to see, it was interesting when I started trying to, it's very interesting in this climate right now, how seeing how scholars of ancient fields are responding to racism now.
Mm-hmm.
And just a few years ago, I finished my MA in 2013. So it's interesting to see the drastic shift. I always
Has
wonder
there
how,
been that much of a shift?
oh God. From what oh my goodness. Oh my God, don't get me started. That's because, you know, I'm very open about how I talk about my experiences and stuff, because I think there's stuff people can learn from them. And some of them are funny to me. I have a way of looking at things that's a bit eccentric. I felt that for the pushback, I guess, from in the Egyptological context, from what I observed, there's a few scholars who will be open or just outright acknowledge that, you know, Kemet is an African civilization. It's just very obvious. I saw that, but the majority, and I have to be honest, because I'm not one of those people, if there's a problem and it's the dominant problem, then I'm focusing on the problem. I'm not going to be like, oh, you're exceptional, so let's focus on the exception, because that doesn't really do anything. That's not constructive. I found that just it really, and especially the way I was in seminar, the way I'm very forward, I'm very frank. You'll see that in, and I don't know if I linked you any of my presentations and emails, but you see how I am. I'm just very direct. It's, you know, we have to stop, you know, pussyfooting around, and just, you know, it's an African civilization, and there's serious analytical implications of that. And I think what it is for scholars, particularly being in a department that is about Near Eastern studies, and that was something I critiqued. I said that name has to be changed to something else. I was very clear about that. I said, and one of the things I was working on was a concept of critical race archaeology. That was something I was working on. Also, a new theory of Kemet and Nubian relations. So getting away from the language of Egyptianization. I don't know if I know you're serious, but you might be familiar with that discourse of Egyptianization.
Very, very little, yes.
Somewhat. Yeah, I'm not going to get in a, you know, a whole thesis into it, but what I will say is this idea that Nubians were just Egyptianized. And one of my problems with this was, how can they be Egyptianized if their cultures are near identical? Like, you're going to call a Nigerian person Ghanified, right, when they're in the same cultural context, right? You know, it sounds puzzling to me. That's the perspective. So I would raise those kind of issues. For some of my peers, I would say the vast majority, it was not a positive reception. It was not a positive reception. Majority was very hostile. Is very much, you know, this resistance of just simply seeing it as simply African. Some faculty, yes, of course, I think were extremely, but for some, it was it's just that idea that no, it's not a multicultural, no, it's not a near, it's just simply African. Because my whole thing is this: if we can accept Nubia, ancient Nubia, and the various nomenclatures associated with it, if we can accept that as African, and Kemet is right there, we know.
Why shouldn't we?
We know that the history of humanity starts around that region of Africa, that eastern Northeast Africa region. What do you think? I mean, we got to kind of just, at some point we just have to be honest with ourselves, right? And that's what I was trying to do with critical race archaeology. And also what I would bring up is we have to critique whiteness. We have to critique, and I was very, very clear about white fragility, like our behavior, like why is this a problem? Well, look, if you're in a majority discipline of people who are fragile with racist discussions about racism, critical ones, not just saying, oh, we're not racist, so we're not going to talk about it. No. You have to see how, as an archaeologist, that affects the way you do archaeology. I don't believe just because it's on the ground that it's sound or you're objective. Even this question of objectivity has to be questioned. So I was very critical of that. And I think it was not positively received by the majority of faculty and peers. It definitely was not. Even, in fact, I remember when applying for the doctoral, this is when I was doing my doctoral applications. Now, Temple was my first choice, just for context, so I'm not upset. That's why I can talk about it, because Temple was my first choice, but I'm like, crap, Temple is also very reputable in, Africana Studies. It's easily the best graduate department in the nation, easily, just because of the spectrum of issues related to African people that can be addressed. I think, and that's going to get to the second half of my problem, but I'll get to that in a moment. But I remember when I applied, there were two schools. I can specify the doctoral program at University of Toronto. What I was told, something along the lines of, not that I didn't qualify. It was more like a topical issue. And I know what I wrote about was, because I said if I was going to go to Africology, I'd write about this. If I was going to go to anthropology, I'd write about this. If I was going to stay at UFT, I'd write about this. And it was going to be critical race archaeology for both the anthropology and Egyptology. And it was more like, okay, we don't want to deal with that kind of topic. So yeah, bye. It was that kind of thing, which was okay because, again, I got my first choice.
You got your first, yeah.
But for the context of our conversations about the seriousness of the problem, this is why I kind of like, I take very few Egyptologists seriously when they talk about decolonization, unless they're, I start to ask more thorough questions like, okay, what are you doing in terms of faculty supporting students? What about name changes, right? So for example, if you're in a situation at University of Toronto where you have a modern Middle Eastern program that was merged with an ancient Near Eastern studies, okay, well, maybe we should change a name that's more inclusive. Maybe do something like, I think one of the concepts I thought of, I said just to actually get us out of it. It can be replaced later, but just to get us in a better direction. Because sometimes I think in steps, not in absolutes. Something like Afrasian. It was some like linguistic concept from Christopher at UCLA that I kind of reapplied and said, let's just call it Afrasian studies, right? Because you're studying a point of intersection between Southwest Asia and Northeast Africa. So why not just do that? And, at least it will get us in a direction, right? And I think for some, they felt like, oh, well, if you take the Near East away from Egypt, you're ignoring contact. That used to come up a lot in a seminar. I said, yeah, people in Ghana have contact with people in the United States who are European. That doesn't mean they're culturally the same. Or Africa, just a lot of back to my bottom line, resistance to accepting the obvious. And it's due to racism. And I would tell people, I said, you don't accept it because you're a racist, because you agree with the dynastic racial theory of Petrie. That's the only reason why we're even having the Near East conversation, because really the burden of proof should be on how is Kemet a Near East civilization, unless you subscribe to the assumptions of the dynastic race theory. Everything else since then has been a refinement of it.
Sorry, just quickly for people who aren't familiar, can you explain what the dynastic race theory is?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Oops, got it. Dynastic race theory, William Flinders Petrie, famous archaeologist of Egypt, British. His theory was that a dynastic race came to civilize, a dynastic race from Southwest Asia came to civilize the indigenous African population in what he would call Egypt. And that was actually where the pharaohs came from. More or less, more or less.
So the pharaohs weren't actually African. They were
just
people
they
who
were
came in. Yeah.
Right. And that's the only reason. Right. And without undoing that, a faulty assumption, everything else that Egyptology has done has just been a refinement of that same argument. At least with his argument, he made up a good fiction. Now we just say abstract things like, oh, well, if I find a flint knife from Phoenicia in someone's grave goods, that means they were a mixed culture. I said that's stupid. That's like saying non-Japanese people who consume Japanese anime are Japanese culture. That's ridiculous. But you see, I also came in with that historical, political background of, you know, how societies work, and that's another thing. So that's why some of these explanations don't make sense in a social, political, or complex context. So that's also something I wanted to address in archaeology, was this idea. We're really specifically within the context of how we study, how we do the archaeology of Kemet, this idea of a material culture. That was something I'm also very critical of. But now, so that's in terms of the Eurocentric side of it. The other side of it, I think the other challenge, which is kind of somewhat surprising, is in Africana Studies, not all departments understand, and there's probably numerous reasons, and you know, I don't want to get too into it. I just want to try to be concise. I think are still resistant to, I think part of it is just African people in the diaspora being resistant to accepting that they're African. So when it comes to, so Afrocentricity is often mocked by racist supported programs that say, no, we should only talk about African Americans, or if you talk about Africa, it should only be West Africa. So they follow that Hegelian model of there's a Black Africa, a North Africa, and Egypt is somehow part of it. So they follow that same model. So they have a Eurocentric way of studying African people from our perspective as Africologists. That's also another issue. Not as big, if you're talking about Kemet, it's not as big as the other one because of the institutional factor, but it's the other thing I've noticed. But being here in the Africology department, I don't really have to deal with that. It's more something I observe externally.
Thank you. I was not expecting you to have pushback from within Africology. That is
not within Africology.
Oh no, sorry.
Sorry. Let me clarify.
That's me misunderstanding.
There's different philosophies in Africana Studies, and some are very hostile to the Afrocentric approach.
Okay.
Because they have a Eurocentric orientation. They don't want to hear that, but they have a Eurocentric orientation to the study of African people in the United States. So, for example, if I'm talking about language and I say, well, if you look at the language of African people in the United States, which should really be called Ebonics, it's not a type of English. Really, it's just relexified African grammar. Basically, vocabulary adjusted, shifted, whatever. Some will look at it as, oh, well, you're ignoring the diversity of African culture. It's really a form of English. It's you can't just say it's African. There's this resistance towards what's essentialism, which, you know, as an Afrocentrist, we don't have a problem with. We understand there's essential aspects to something. We're not necessarily essentialism. That's not the basis of it, but we understand there's an essence to certain things. There's a cultural essence to people. I think that's arbitrary. I think it's silly to ignore that. So I hope that's clear. So within Africana Studies, there's resistance to Afrocentric approaches.
I see. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying. So you said that there's been a shift in how academics are dealing with issues of race and kind of the Eurocentric approach to viewing history. Do you, and I sent Tristan a bunch of questions beforehand, so we're going off script now. So my apologies to everyone. I'm kind of thinking as I talk. You said there's been a shift in how people are approaching this. Do do you see it as a positive shift, or is it people just kind of digging in their heels and entrenching themselves?
Well, I guess I've seen a shift in attention in terms of, and largely it's based on, because I don't think I'll see it in the academy reflected until like 3 years. Because you know how journal articles and books come out, how that, how that works usually takes a few years for when everyone's writing. But in terms of social media, blogs, groups, such as yourself who've created blogs and stuff, I've been observing those for a long time. There's more of a willingness to discuss, that there is racism in, fields of ancient studies. There's more willingness to discuss it. But the terms of that discourse is where I raise my skeptical eyebrows. Like, okay, let's see where this goes. Let's see where this goes. Some people have been genuine about it. I'm not denying that, but the majority, I'm like, is this just just catching on a trend thing? So that's what I would say with that.
That makes a lot of sense. Going back to the name thing, one of my professional organizations, the 𝀭Support, has recently voted to remove Oriental from its name, but they're having
finally.
It's taken a while, but like you said, they're having the problem of how do we? So they're keeping the acronym for now because they don't have a replacement name, and getting everyone to even agree that the O in 𝀭Support was racist and needed to be removed was like a long uphill battle by a lot of people. And your comment about not thinking in like terms of absolutes with renaming things, just a step away and a step towards a better answer. Like we don't, like no one seems to know where to go from here. They've said, okay, we're not keeping Oriental, but none of the other names they've come up with have been even halfway accepted by the majority of members. So they're still kind of working on renaming themselves. That was a bit of a random tangent. We've had a question from one of our viewers. 𝀭Support Energy asks, does Tristan have a theory about why so much of history has been whitewashed?
A theory, I mean, I don't even know if I could call it a theory. I just think it's really as simple as, that's what happens in a system of white supremacy is, you have to degrade the people that you're terrorizing, right? You can't be, for just to put it in the context of Egyptology, I don't think it's a coincidence that, as a field, it emerges at the time where African people, well, the European interest in Egypt, because obviously Egyptology later becomes formalized in the 19th century. When Napoleon, again, he's someone who's, ruler of France. We know what happened to him in Haiti, right? This is someone who's involved in the system of enslavement of African people. So you're not going to acknowledge that, the people who built these pyramids, the Sphinx that you admire, are also the same race of people that you're enslaving. No one wants to. And that's really what it comes down to. If I had to put it in a concise way, there's obviously nuances within that, but the core of it is no one's gonna, want to say anything empowering to people they're trying to disempower.
Thank you. Audience, if you have questions for Tristan, now is the time to get them in because we're going to start wrapping up relatively soon. Thank you all for joining us. Tristan, we've been talking a lot about kind of the theories and paradigms behind the research you do. Would you like to talk a little bit about the language work that you do?
The language work that I do, so what I'm doing, it's funny because remember what I said, I don't like talking in apps. This is part of why, because just with some of my conclusions, I'm like that. I don't like to really jump into conclusions. That's how my personality is. But to just give a summary, what I'm looking at, how would I explain it? So I'm looking at the Kemetic language, in the indigenous terms, Medu-Neter, which in English would largely translate to the words of the divine, or the sacred words, depending who you ask, more or less. That's how they the reverence for their language.
Mhm.
I'm looking at it from the perspective of Afro-Caribbean languages and to some extent how African people in the United States talk. Really looking at how we view the grammar. So one of the things that I've been arguing is, well, part of the problem with the way that we interpret Medu Neter is that, and I don't think it's really addressed. I don't think it's. Let me just continue. It's not really addressed the fact that the languages we're dealing with are European. So that has a serious implication. Like, I think, a reasonable scholar, a reasonable philologist can tell you, yeah, there's certain things that get lost in translation, right?
Mhm.
In terms of how we're looking at the language. I don't think I would get much pushback on that.
Mhm.
But what I would say, and I think would be more pushback, is we have to really have different grammars for African languages that are based on the language itself internally. And the only way to do an internal analysis of the language is through African languages. And when I say that, I also include Afro-Caribbean languages in that conversation and African American Ebonics in that conversation. Because I can tell you, as someone who's been taught the language from an English perspective, see, that's the thing. You have to realize when you're doing it from French, English, or German, your language carries a cultural perspective. There's no culture
Mhm.
neutral language. English is part of the European cultural canon. Like, there's no and, if, or buts around that. Medu
Mhm.
Neter, language of so-called ancient Egypt, is part of the African canon, and there's implications for that. So my dissertation research explores that from an Afro-Caribbean context. So when I'm looking at certain passages in Medu Neter, and I'm realizing it from the perspective because I speak Jamaican, what some people might know it as patois or Jamaican Creole in academic literature. When you look at it from that perspective as opposed to English, you notice certain things that English just isn't going to get.
Mhm.
And why? Because you're dealing with two African people. Just like if I look at the hairstyles, I'm going to have a different response than say, I would put you on the spot, Megan, than say Megan would, because
I
right,
know. Yeah.
we have different it's just culturally different, and there's nothing
Mhm.
wrong with it. I think that's one of the problems that I think colonialism does. Is it's not that pointing difference is the problem, is colonialism pathologizes difference. I always, and as a teaching instructor and I deal with a lot of race courses such, I
Mhm.
always try to emphasize to students, it's not that you recognize someone's different, right? It's a system that pathologizes a particular form of difference and suppresses it, fetishizes it, et cetera,
Mhm.
and in various ways. So language is one of those ways where it's very obvious that there's nothing Near Eastern about at
Mhm.
all. I can guarantee there's nothing, right? Because if that was the case, I should not be seeing what I'm seeing. Like, I should not be seeing the same usage of verbs like I
Mhm.
see it in the Haitian language or the Jamaican language or African American Ebonics. If it was truly unrelated to Africa, I would be seeing it,
Mhm.
because those languages are essentially extensions of the African world. And I saw a question earlier about that, about African American Ebonics, why it's not a type of English. The problem in which way we learn language is that you define a language based on its grammar and phonology more so than its vocabulary. For example, I'm gonna have to embarrass myself for a moment. I remember when I tried to teach myself Spanish when I was very young. I would just look up words in a dictionary and put them together the same way that they are in English.
Mhm.
But when I started reading subtitles in films, I was confused.
Mhm.
I didn't know what was going on. Why? Because there's a certain grammatical difference between Spanish and English,
Mhm.
right? It's the same thing with German. It's the same thing with Greek and Latin. They're related, obviously, for obvious reasons. We know that, but there's a certain difference between them that you see in grammar. When you look at the grammar of African American Ebonics, of Afro-Caribbean languages, it's consistent with African languages.
Mhm.
That's why a lot of what I'm seeing in Medu Neter, the way Egyptologists explain certain things, could correct some of the ways that linguists and the ways linguists analyze Afro-Caribbean languages or African American Ebonics, right?
Mhm.
Because it's another African language and it's been analyzed in its own sort of sector. And vice versa, there are concepts in Afro-Caribbean languages that would be more applicable to Medu Neter than what I see in Egyptology. Because Linguistics as a discipline and Egyptology have the same problem. They both have a Eurocentric orientation, and this comes to bear when you're dealing with two African cultures.
Mm-hmm.
It's just,
Thank
you need a different model.
Mm-hmm. Just briefly to build off something you said at the beginning of your answer, one of the things that I've seen coming up on like Twitter and YouTube comments, which can be an interesting forum for these kinds of discussions, is why some people are trying to push academic diversity. Like what's wrong with the current system and looking at the way that we have done for the past several hundred years. And the answer, I think, is the one that you gave, and that we spoke to a Black classicist a few months ago now, Bet Hux, and she gave the same response. It's a matter of what people bring to the table based on who they are. Like you were saying with the hairstyles, you will have a different understanding, a different interpretation than I will, and I will have a different understanding to someone else. And the more people that we have involved in the study of history from different diverse backgrounds, the better we collectively understand the societies we're trying to study, rather than just kind of gatekeeping and making sure everything is like white European men all the time, or white European women. We had one more question, and then I think we will wrap this up. Digital Gnosis says, Tristan, what do you think about theories which say that all Abrahamic religions are knockoffs copying ancient Egyptian religions?
I was just having a conversation about, I always have conversations about this. Appreciate the question, Digital Gnosis. I would say, in my view, I think what African cultures have is not religions. We tend to use religions because we're in a European academy, and how we deal with the metaphysical in a European academy, or Eurocentric academy rather, it's religious. Right? But what African cultures have are, they have their cultural way of being, right? It's just their cultural things rather than religious things. It's not something that's separate from their society. This is very important. So in that context, I've heard that argument before. I don't see Abrahamic religions as copying the cultural system of Kemet. I mean, its various nuances. I don't see that at all. I think there might be, at best, maybe some borrowings, maybe at best, but they're formulated by a different cultural ethos, a European, Southwest Asian cultural ethos that's not really comparable. I've heard that. It's funny. It's just really funny because I had a conversation about this just yesterday. So yeah, I would, to answer your question, they're not. They're two different, totally different things. You can tell. Look at the creation stories in Kemet and compare the creation story in the Bible, and I can tell you, you can see the cultural contrast. And then look at other creation stories in African cultures, and compare it to that. You'll see that Kemet is pretty consistent with that. It's not consistent with Abrahamic religions. I think what it is people who don't want to confront the Eurocentric or maybe Eurasian-centric aspect of those religions. They have a cultural specificity in them. Mm-hmm. Like everything does. Right? You know what I mean? Because I think that's really what's important about what I love about Afrocentricity, is that it's not that everybody has to be Afrocentric. That's silly. What Eurocentrism does is that Eurocentric is superior and everyone must be Eurocentric, including those who are not European. Afrocentricity, we understand the beauty, we see the beauty in plurality. We're just simply saying, for African phenomena, you should study it Afrocentrically. Mm-hmm. You're not going to treat a dog the way you treat a cat. Me and Big are having a chat about this, and I know the differences. It's just really enlightening, right? You're not going to, put a Doberman Pinscher in your Siamese cat's litter box, right? And you're not going to feed a Siamese cat a bone, right? You're not going to do that, right? That's the whole point. That's the whole point.
Thank you. So we have not had any other questions, so I'm going to let everyone go and get on with their Saturday afternoon. Tristan, thank you very much for coming and talking to us. It's been fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was great.
Of course.
If anyone is for the audience, with very good questions.
Yeah, no, everyone has been wonderful. I'm going to go through the description and put links to Tristan's Twitter, for anyone who would like to follow him on Twitter. And he very kindly sent me some reading materials. So I will put that in a little bibliography if anyone is interested in following up on this, which I recommend you do because it's very interesting. Yes. So Tristan, thank you again for joining me. Audience, thank you for joining me. And remember, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?